Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar with the National Council for History Education and the UK National Archives. My name is Claire Howard, and I am the Communications Coordinator for NCHE. Thank you for joining us. This is on the British perspectives of the Battle of Lexington and Concord using primary sources. The session is presented by Andrew Payne, Head of Education and Outreach at the UK National Archives. Andrew is an experienced history educator who has worked extensively to make archival collections accessible for teachers, students, and the wider public. If you have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A and we will address them towards the end of the session. And Andrew, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, and good evening from here, good afternoon to you over there. And I'm just going to share my screen so that we can get started. So, Claire, just checking that everybody can see the screen here. That's good. Good. So, welcome, and let me start with, as we always do with our education workshops that we run at the National Archives, let me start with a little mystery document for you, and feel free to kind of chip in on the chat. Who, where, and when wrote this? So let me read this to you. That attempting to conquer America internally by land force is as wild an idea as ever controverted common sense, and will be in the end apparent. Adieu, etc. EH. So if you have any thoughts about who wrote that, where they may have been, and when, please maybe add them into chat now. Let's have a look and see what's coming up. By the way, hi John in Ireland. Rob Good is saying Edmund Burke. That's an interesting suggestion. Do we have any others? So let me give you a little clue. Oh, a little clue here. If I move to the next slide, and Rob Good might think that he's sort of on the right track. So actually I had obscured a couple of words there, and also the location, whether that helps. So the actual phrase is that attempting to conquer America internally by our land force is as wild an idea as ever controverted common sense, and will be in the end apparent. Adieu, and etc. E.H. London, 30th of June, 1775. Do you have any other suggestions as to... So Rob was correct in suggesting that it's coming from London. Let me put you out of your misery. So this is a quote from Edward Harvey, who was a British commander. He was actually like a military advisor to King George III. He had experience of fighting in North America. He'd actually settled briefly in North America as well, but was now based in back in London as one of the chief military advisors to King George. And I think it's just one of those lovely examples of the insight that our record collection, this is from our WO stands for War Office, one of those kind of private communications that we have in our collection. He's actually writing to a commander in America with this, but it's a recognition about the situation and the difficulty of the situation which the British are going to face. And you can see from the date that this is shortly after those battles in Lexington and Concord. And it's just one of the many documents that we have related to that, including this fabulous plan. This is, as it says, a plan of the town and harbour of Boston and the country adjacent with the road from Boston to Concord, showing the place of the late engagement between the King's troops and the provincials, together with the several encampments of both armies in and about Boston. And it's taken from a survey that was done by Richard Wentworth, and produced by John DaCosta. And I mean, certainly, if any of you teach any geography as well as history, I'm sure you'll recognize that, you know, the terrain around Boston, that hilly terrain, and plus the inlets, the coves, the rivers, and so on, was going to make any kind of military campaign extremely difficult, particularly for the British, who know the terrain less well than the local militiamen. And that's always something that you need to bear in mind. You know, geography and history are bound together like a hand in glove. And, you know, the two influence each other enormously. But I think particularly when it comes to any kind of military campaign, you have to always remember the geography, the landscape, the terrain, and so on, because it's so influential and so important. Let me just kind of roll back a little bit and talk briefly a little bit about where I am or where I work. So this is the National Archives of the United Kingdom. We're the official archive for the British government. We're a large building, so aerial view is there. So we've got on kind of to the top centre is the building that was established in the 1970s, and then we have a further extension that was built in the 1990s. In total, inside, well, around the outside, it's around a quarter of a mile, but actually inside we have 165 miles of documents spread across 8 repositories. And even that isn't enough for our collection, because we have somewhere in the region of another 30 to 35 miles of shelving in a deep store in a salt mine in the north of the country. And it's a collection which is not only paper and parchment, but is increasingly a digital collection as well, as government continues to transfer its records to us. It goes back actually over 1,000 years. Our first official public record is Domesday Book from 1086, the Great Survey that William the Conqueror undertook after conquering England. But we do actually have some documents that predate that from the Anglo-Saxon era. And we hold key constitutional documents for the UK, including the constitutionally significant versions of Magna Carta. So we all know about 1215 with King John, but of course King John does away with his version of Magna Carta, but it is then reissued continually by his son Henry III, and also by his grandson Edward I, and it's the reissuing of Magna Carta that makes it part of the English and eventually the British Constitution. But we also hold key constitutional documents for other countries, including your own. We actually have 5 copies of the American Declaration of Independence, very kindly because you insisted on sending them to us, which was a lovely thing to do, seeing as they're now worth somewhere in the region of $10 to $15 million each. So every time you felt the need to send us one, we were just ringing up the change. But these are the versions that were printed on the night of the 4th of July by John Dunlap at his print shop in Philadelphia, using the text that was given to him. And those were used to distribute around 200 copies were distributed around the 13 colonies to declare that formal independence. We also have one of the largest collections of maps. I think only the American archives have more maps than we do, but we hold some of the earliest maps for America, including William Hull's print of John Smith's map of the Georgetown settlement. Sorry, the settlement in Virginia. And other parts of our collection, very quickly, you want to know how to build a steam engine, you can find that in our collection. We hold the telegrams that were sent from the Titanic as they were sinking, because those were collected by or picked up by other ships in the vicinity and were then sent to the Board of Trade inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic. We even hold the UFO files from our Ministry of Defence. So it's a huge, varied collection. And we also take in modern government records continually on almost a week-by-week basis. So it's an ever-expanding collection. Now, that collection, my team have the responsibility for mediating and turning into education resources, and you can find all of those education resources free to access for everybody, including yourselves, on the National Education section of the National Archives website. You can follow the link at the top, or if you do the QR code thing, get your cameras out now. And there's a few more QR codes coming. So if you do have your phone with you, you may want to just grab these as well. So on the education website, you will find an ever-expanding number of resources, including resources that we are working on recently around the American Revolution. So the first of those that we produced last year was around the Boston Tea Party, which again you can get from the QR code, or just search Boston Tea Party UK National Archives and it should come up. We have a second lesson available around thoughts and theories. So the kind of political ideas that were underpinning the American Revolution, where do those come from? And unsurprisingly, a lot of them herald back to our own revolution 100 years before. And then finally, and most appropriately for this session, I appear to have the wrong heading for that. That should be early conflicts in the American Revolution. So that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. And you can find a full downloadable lesson with extracts of the documents which I'm using tonight, or some of the documents anyway that I'm using for this. Before I go on though, I just want to kind of emphasize the difference between archives and libraries. Certainly from students' perspectives, but also I think from kind of the general public, there's a confusion around what an archive is. Most people understand about libraries, and I talk about libraries as repositories of stories and thoughts and ideas. And I think most people kind of understand that. But archives are often a bit of a mystery to people, and I describe them as repositories of activity. So as people do things, they leave behind a trail of maps and plans and letters and account books and charts and illustrations and so on, which are kind of like footprints in the snow. As they go about their daily activity, they're leaving this trail of documents which allow us as historians to try and access what the original activity was. These document collections that we have, you know, they're a gateway to the original activity that was taking place, because they're created as that activity is occurring for all sorts of reasons. And I think that's really, really important. If you think about not so much about the documents, but the activity that creates the documents, then those documents begin to have real value and significance. So if we're thinking about the activity of governing America on the eve of revolution and throughout the course of the Revolutionary War, we need to kind of understand, you know, what were the organs, what were the institutions that were involved in the government of America at this time, and the communication that happens between them, because that's absolutely vital. It's that communication that sits within our collection. So in Britain, we have the monarchy, King George III, with his Privy Council, which is made up of leading advisors. But also we have the Prime Minister and Cabinet. So the monarch has his own kind of personal council, if you like, and advisors, which Edward Harvey is an example of that. But of course, we're a parliamentary constitutional monarchy, And so he, whether he likes it or not, has to work with Parliament, and he has to work with um, a Prime Minister and a cabinet that have the support of Parliament. In the American colonies, there are colonial governors who are appointed by the monarch and are responsible for the governing of those 13 colonies that have developed over the past 120 years or so. But also we have, back in the UK, we have Parliament, the representative assembly of the people of the UK, but of course not the representative assembly of those in America, because they had their own assemblies. So each colony had its own assembly. And so the idea of representation is very firmly established both in Britain and America. Perhaps something worth remembering when we talk about taxation without representation. But also there are other departments of government which are absolutely vital to the governing of America. The Treasury, obviously, for taking in taxation, and also the assigning of taxation for war and for other activities. The Colonial Office, who are the kind of direct channel of administration to the colonies in both America, Canada, and the Caribbean. And the Board of Trade, which is absolutely essential for the regulation of economic activity. But then we also have other channels as well. So we have the Secretary at War, who is responsible for the army, and we also have the Admiralty, who are responsible for the Navy. And they have direct correspondence with the commands, the military and Admiralty commands in America. And then finally, we've got that kind of popular aspect, the newspapers, the broadsheets, the popular commentaries, and also personal correspondence. And those, for various reasons, are very predominant within our collection as well. We'll understand a bit more about why we have so much personal correspondence within our own collection as I go through the presentation. But here's the really important thing to remember about this. And I think it's something that, again, gets missed. And I've already mentioned about the importance of geography for history. And of course, you know, the important thing when it comes to the governing of America from Britain is that it's a geography that's separated by some 3,500 miles of ocean. And that's a delay in administration of somewhere between 4 and 12 weeks, depending on weather conditions, depending on the time to actually not just sail across America, but to actually send messages within the colonial America as well. And so, and if we're thinking about perhaps colonial governors sending reports back to London and awaiting instruction from London, that can easily be somewhere in the region of 2, 3, maybe even 4 months of delay. And we see that very clearly in our correspondence that we have in our collection. Every letter has to be numbered, and they refer to the number of their correspondence, so that it's clear as to, you know, what is actually happening at what particular time. And the response that will come back from the British government in London will refer to those particular letters. So what are the key record series in our collection if you're researching the Revolutionary War? And again, if we're thinking about documents representing the activity of war, I think it becomes quite obvious where those collections will sit. First of all, this is not a completely comprehensive list, but certainly, you know, a good introductory list to the record series that if you wanted to undertake research, where would you go to look? ADM stands for Admiralty, because you know, the British Navy is absolutely essential to the founding, establishment, and support of the British Empire. The Chancery, so that's one of the key departments of government at this time. Customs, of course, because of the incoming and outgoing trade that occurs with America, and keeping a record of everything that goes into the colonies and comes out, because as we know, that's a source of income, both for colonial governments and also for the government back in Britain. So tariffs, we all know a lot about tariffs now, don't we? But tariffs were the main source of income for colonial governors and also for the government back in London. The Colonial Office, that's the London-based office that effectively liaises with those colonial governors and is responsible for the administration of the colonies. The Exchequer, and to do with finance, the Foreign Office. You'll find records in our Foreign Office collection, even though the Foreign Office officially isn't established until later. Records are then sort of accessioned into the Foreign Office, so it's worth looking there as well. High Court of Admiralty is a really interesting one, because that's where a lot of those personal correspondence are to be found. Basically, this is where the Royal Navy seizes foreign ships, and in doing so takes off everything of value, and it then goes to the High Court of Admiralty to decide where should that go to. And any bags of post and correspondence and so on just sit in the High Court of Admiralty collection, and we're undertaking a 20-year research project to basically go through and open all of these letters. And it's a huge global post bag that covers around 250 years. It's a massive collection and has some really, really important letters relating to the Revolutionary War. Treasury, because it's about finance. Obviously, lots of maps and plans, because it's about the geography. And finally, the War Office, because that's the Secretary at War, who's responsible for the army. And then one final collection, what we call Zipper. These are newspapers and publications that reveal kind of everyday life and society. And that's a fabulous insight into perspectives into newspaper reports about what's occurring, both newspaper reports from America, which are sent back to the Colonial Office, but also reports in Britain about what is happening in America, which can give a very powerful insight. So these all provide insights into different aspects of the conflicts, and they reveal personal as well as public attitudes. So it's a huge collection and an incredibly rich collection. So the kind of insights we get, obviously, we get insights into the military conflict. So communications like this is General Thomas Gage, who is the commander-in-chief at the time of Lexington and Concord. He's writing to Earl Dartmouth, who is the colonial secretary based back in London. And in this case, this is from the 22nd of April, shortly after those events at Lexington and Concord. And Gage gives a very dramatic personal account of what happens during that. So, I am to acquaint your lordship that, having received intelligence of a large quantity of military stores being collected at Concord for the avowed purpose of supplying a body of troops to act in opposition to His Majesty's government, I got the grenadiers and light infantry out of town, that's out of Boston, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Smith of the 10th Regiment and Major Pitcairn of the Marines, with as much secrecy as possible. But of course, we all know about Revere's famous ride, however inaccurate that may be from the poem, but we know that attempt to get the British troops out of Boston to attack Concord and Lexington in secrecy was unsuccessful. As he then recounts, it appears from the firing of alarm guns and ringing of bells that the march of Lieutenant Colonel Smith was discovered, and he was opposed by a body of men within 6 miles of Concord, some few of whom first began to fire upon his advance companies, which brought on a fire from the troops that dispersed the body opposed to them, and they proceeded to Concord, where they destroyed all of the military stores that they could find. And so he goes on the return of the troops, they were attacked from all quarters where any cover was to be found, from whence it was practical to annoy them. And they were so fatigued with their march that it was with difficulty that they could keep out their flanking parties to remove the enemy to a distance, so that they were at length a good deal pressed. And finally, he comments, the loss sustained by those who attacked is said to be great. The whole country was assembled in arms with surprising expedition, and several thousand are now assembled about this town, again referring to Boston, threatening an attack and getting up artillery, and we are very busy in making preparations to oppose them. So we have a very dramatic first-hand or second-hand account based on the reports that come back to Gage from his officers. And we also get an insight from the reports that he keeps around the casualties. So this is the casualty list for the British, 62 killed, 157 wounded, and 24 missing. So that's the kind of military communication that you will find. And that's certainly kind of the official military accounts, but you will also find personal assessments of these. So in this case, again, Gage giving a personal assessment of the enemy. And he says, the loss sustained by those who attacked is said to be great. The whole country was assembled in arms with surprising expedition, and several thousand are now assembled around the town. And we are very busy in making preparations to oppose them. And then your lordship will perceive that the conquest of this country is not easy and can be effected only by time and perseverance. Strong armies attacking in various quarters and dividing their forces, confining your operations on this side only in attacking in the strongest part, and you have to cope with vast numbers. So there's quite an open personal assessment about the enemy that he's facing and about the strength of that enemy, about their ability to use the terrain to their advantage, and that if the British are going to be successful in resisting them, they really do need to organize themselves and commit significant forces. So that's the kind of official correspondence that you'll find, but you'll also get within that you will find individual accounts, both from the loyalist side, from the British side, and as we'll see in a little while, from the patriot side, from the American side. Here's two accounts of the same event, which is always interesting. This is, as it says, a circumstantial account of an attack that happened on the 19th of April on His Majesty's troops. It's an account by an anonymous author, but was a broadsheet that was published and would have been distributed. And so when we get into the conflict of who fired the first shot, this is one account, and we'll see another account in a minute. When they arrived at the end of the village, Lexington, they observed about 200 armed men drawn up on a green, and when the troops came within 100 yards of them, they began to file off towards some stone walls on their right flank. The light infantry, that's the British, observing this, began to run after them. The major instantly called to the soldiers not to fire, but to surround and disarm them. Some of them, who had jumped over a wall, fired 4 or 5 shots at the troops, wounded a man of the 10th Regiment and the Major's horses in 2 places, and at the same time, several shots were fired from a meeting house on the left. So, proof, perhaps, that the first shots were fired by the Americans. Or, of course, if you go to another account, in this case, this is a later account from May, published in the Georgia Gazette. At Lexington, 6 miles below Concord, a company of militia of about 100 men mustered near the meeting house. The troops came in sight of them just before sunrise, and running within a few rods of them, the commanding officer accosted the militia in words of this manner: "You rebels! Damn you! Put down your arms and disperse." And immediately 1 or 2 officers discharged their pistols. So there we have an alternative account placing the start of military hostilities on the British, which is to be believed perhaps it doesn't matter anymore, but the more important thing is that we, have these two different perspectives. And of course, as with any conflict, perception is reality, isn't it? Um, it's perhaps futile to try and argue who fires those first shots. Um, the important thing is, how do people respond when they hear the news, and what stories develop out of that news. And of course, most importantly, it's the reactions of the political leaders to those early conflicts. So in the case of Americans, the Second Continental Congress makes a serious attempt to try and re-establish a relationship with the British government. The Olive Branch Petition from July, just 2 months later, 1775, is sent to King George. And it's an attempt, I think, really to appeal over the head of people like Dartmouth, the colonial secretary, and the other advisors. It's a direct appeal to the king to suggest that perhaps he's being ill-advised and he really needs to be aware of the true situation. Hence, your Majesty's ministers, preserving in their measures and proceeding to open hostilities for enforcing them, have compelled us to arm in our own defence, and have engaged us in a controversy so peculiarly abhorrent, strongly objected, to the affections of your still faithful colonists, that when we consider whom we must oppose in this contest, and if it continues, what may be the consequences of our own particular misfortunes, are accounted by us only as part of our distress. So a genuine desire, I think, by American leaders at the Second Continental Congress to try and resolve things peacefully, if at all possible. Let's be honest, family relations between American colonists and British are very close. And in many respects, this is effectively a civil war. And something that we shouldn't take lightly. I think that it is huge reluctance, that a feeling that they have to take up arms. And of course, the response, as we know, is that the king declares them rebels, and in doing so, basically opens up the war, enables the army to act freely against that, and to really begin a full-blown campaign against the rebellion. Whereas many of our subjects in diverse parts of our colonies and plantations in North America, misled by dangerous and ill-designing men, you notice that that's a common theme on both sides, the idea that people are being misled, and forgetting the allegiance which they owe to the power that has protected and sustained them, after various disorderly acts committed in disturbance of the public peace, to the obstruction of lawful commerce, and to the oppression of our loyal subjects carrying on the same, have at length proceeded to an open and avowed rebellion, by arraying themselves in hostile manner to withstand the execution of the law, and traitorously preparing, ordering, and levying war against us. So we can see that those early skirmishes very, very quickly deteriorate into full-blown hostility on both sides. And it's not just in New England and Old England that the consequences are felt. Across the rest of British America, the consequences of what happens at Lexington and Concord are very obvious as well. This is a correspondence from Dartmouth, who is the colonial secretary, as I say, to Josiah Martin, who is the British governor of North Carolina, again in July 1775. And he says, in consequence of the advices received from all quarters, that not only the 4 New England governments are in arms, but also every other colony has catched the flame, and the spirit of rebellion has gone forth that menaces the subversion of the Constitution. It is the King's firm resolution that the most vigorous efforts should be made, both by sea and land to reduce his rebellious subjects to obedience. And the proper measures are now pursuing not only for augmenting the army under General Gage, but also for making such addition to our naval strength in North America as may enable Admiral Graves to make such a disposition of his fleet. And there's a real recognition that perhaps all is not lost, that whilst New England may be in full-blown rebellion, the rest of the country perhaps isn't yet lost. The other colonies, particularly to the south, there appears to be a greater allegiance within those. Hence, there is still some room to hope that the colonies to the southern may not proceed to the same lengths with those of New England. It is, however, His Majesty's intention that the commander of the separate squadrons I have mentioned should be instructed to prevent all commerce between the colonies within their respective stations. So this is a real attempt to try and separate off New England from the rest of the American colonies, and to try and perhaps stem any growing opposition within the southern colonies, particularly the Carolinas and Virginia. But as we know, that's not successful, that the militias within those colonies make attempts and seize arms and grow very rapidly. And as we see by November in Virginia, this is Dunmore, who is the Governor General of Virginia, issuing a proclamation. And I think, it's really important that we recognize just how perhaps, extreme the situation has become, that Dunmore feels the need to issue this proclamation. I should just say that our documents inevitably reflect language and attitude of the time. Whilst we recognize that there can be distressing language in documents, we think it's important that we don't remove that it's part of the historic record. And so terminology that we no longer think is acceptable, you will find in our records. But I think that's an important point to make, both to you as teachers, but also for you to make to your students if you do use these records. So he begins by saying, in virtue of the power and authority to me given by His Majesty, determined to execute martial law and cause the same to be executed throughout this colony, and to the end that peace and good order may be soon restored. I do require every person capable of bearing arms to resort to His Majesty's standard, or to look upon as traitors to His Majesty's crown and government, and thereby become liable to the penalty the laws inflicted upon such offences, such as forfeiture of life, confiscation of lands, etc., etc. So this is the declaration of martial law in Virginia, but that's not in itself considered to be enough. What Dunmore does is he makes an appeal to that large portion of the population who are enslaved. And in doing so, he says, I do hereby further declare all indented servants, Negroes, and others appertaining to rebels free, that are able and willing to bear arms. They join His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity. Now, I don't think it can be underestimated enough about how serious the British recognized the situation to be, and Dunmore recognized the situation to be. Bearing in mind that the British have enslaved subjects across the Caribbean, across the colonies in America, the fact that they are prepared to grant freedom to the enslaved if they will come and fight for them is a recognition of just how serious this conflict is becoming. And also, I do further and require all His Majesty's liege subjects to retain their quit rents. That's the annual rent, effectively, that they would pay for their land, to retain those, or any other taxes due that may become due, in their own custody. So basically, you no longer have to pay any tax. You can retain that for yourself. till such time as peace may again be restored to this present most unhappy country, or demanded of them by their former salutary purposes, by officers properly authorised to receive them. So what Dunmore doesn't want is people paying taxes to the colonial government, to the Assembly, because the Assembly are diverting those taxes to the rebellion. So he's saying you don't have to pay taxes anymore. So, these are pretty extreme measures that the British are resorting to. And ultimately, in another 2 years' time, they will actually remove all taxation, as we see after the Battle of Saratoga. There's a very belated attempt by the King and Parliament by removing all taxation from America, but it's perhaps too little, too late. We also get personal correspondence, not only because of the High Court of Admiralty intercepting ships, but also because the Colonial Secretary George Germain in 1775 orders that the post office should intercept all correspondence and secretly open letters and then make a note of what they say and then reseal them and pass them on. And that's seen as a valuable way of kind of trying to understand what the mood of the country is, seeing the correspondence both within and between America and Britain, because of course people are corresponding with their families and friends between the two countries. Here's a lovely example. Henry Hugh Ferguson, who's a patriot in Philadelphia, writing to a friend, and he's very clear. This is October 1775. He says, "Unless Parliament relaxes this winter, I have good authority for assuring you that the colonies will declare themselves independent of the Crown of Britain next spring." Slightly preemptive, but certainly, as we know, by July of 1776, the Declaration of Independence is made. So, the British will be intercepting these letters, acutely aware of the mood that's occurring in different colonies. Likewise, we have personal reflections on the conflict from loyalists. In this case, this is a letter that's being sent to Henry Kruger, who's a member of Parliament in the British Parliament, member of Parliament for Bristol, about political support for rebels in Britain. We now look for news from your side of the water, so from the British side. Heaven grant that the measures of Parliament may be so concerted as effectually to settle this unhappy contest, so that it will be sunk into eternal oblivion, in which it would be injustice of an American to suppose that you will not do everything in your power. So, a real request there from loyalists in America for Parliament to do something about this and to try and settle this, because there is a real feeling that even by late 1775, it might just be possible to retrieve the situation. But it's not only in America that you will find support. And I think this is something that's well worth remembering. And this is why I say it's very much effectively like a civil war, because there is a huge amount of support in Britain for what's happening in America. I mean, obviously, we know later on Tom Paine becomes one of the leading exponents with his treatise on common sense and later the rights of man, about why self-government for America is, a good thing. But with the reports coming back of the military action that's beginning to break out at Lexington and Concord, we see that there are attempts to rouse up opposition to the government in Britain. King George is not popular in Britain. And there's been a series of acts introduced in the 1760s and 1770s to suppress opposition to the government in Britain itself. And that's deeply unpopular. We have what are called corresponding societies established. The coffee houses in London and other cities are centres of political dissent. And here's a lovely example of this. This is where a printer, Henry Sampson Woodfall, is charged with seditious libel. And this is a court case. It goes to King's Bench, which is one of the royal courts, where he's basically published an article in a newspaper called the Public Advertiser, which was quite a seditious newspaper. And this is the charge against him. Henry Sampson Woodfall, native London printer, being a wicked, malicious, seditious and ill-disposed person, and greatly disaffected to our said present sovereign lord the king, to insinuate and cause it to be believed that divers of his majesty's innocent and serving subjects have been inhumanely murdered by his said majesty's troops in the province of, or colony or plantation of the Massachusetts Bay in New England in America, and published a certain wicked, malicious, scandalous and seditious libel entitled The Public Advertiser. So again, within our collection, we see there's a growing amount of support within Britain for what's happening in America, and that really this isn't a war between Britain and America. It's a war between liberals and radicals in Britain and America, and conservatives, Tories in Britain and America, those who support the King's government and those who oppose the King's government. And I think there's a real fear that that rebellion that's there in America will spread to Britain, as of course eventually it does to Ireland in 1798. One final collection that you'll find, so are satirical commentaries, cartoons. It's such a rich period. The political commentaries, cartoons, publications, broadsheets, and so on are so rich. And this is a fabulous one, produced by a quite famous married couple of satirists, Mary and Matthias Darley, who have a publishing house in the Strand in London, commenting on Bunker's Hill, or the America's headdress. So we have this. They were well known for commenting on and ridiculing the quite outrageous hairstyles of the day, the wigs that many people wore, and portraying those in extreme ways. And what they've done here is to combine their commentary on dress and headwear with political events and military events in America. So this woman is portrayed with this absolutely extreme hairstyle in which the events of Lexington and Concord are taking place. But we can see that actually when we look in closely, they're ridiculing the actions of the British Army at Lexington, or actually at Bunker Hill, implying that they're causing themselves more harm than actually the revolutionary forces are. I think the flags are significant. We have a monkey, we have a goose. They're ridiculing the different regiments. We have two women armed with lightning bolts. I think that's an emphasizing the fact we've got Britannia and Columbia possibly represented by those two women, throwing lightning bolts at each other. But perhaps the significant thing is that they're implying that the British forces are firing on themselves effectively and are highly ineffectual. They do a similar kind of a follow-on satirical commentary during the evacuation of Boston by the British, where they make it very clear that they view that as a running away by the British. So down to the last 10 minutes, just a final word then, back to Edward Harvey, that military advisor that we saw at the beginning. Some other correspondence. This one to General Howe, who is the commander of military forces by 1775, by June 1775. And Harvey, very candidly says, Unless a settled plan of operations be agreed upon for next spring, our army will be destroyed by damned driblets. You know, the Americans are so effective at that guerrilla warfare. They're so effective at picking off the British units. Harvey is, you know, he doesn't beat about the bush. He's very clear. You know, we've got to get ourselves organized. We need, he actually says to the king, we can't defeat the Americans on the land. We have to blockade them and try, basically kind of starve them into submission, and get them back to the negotiating table. And then just a few days later, he writes again to a friend of his in America, Lieutenant Colonel Francis, and I think this sums it up beautifully. America is an ugly job, a damned affair indeed. Thank you very much for taking in some of the British perspectives on those events at Lexington and Concord. If you have any comments or questions, I'm happy to take those now. You're very welcome. If you do have any questions, I'm happy to take those, or if you want to pass those back through Claire and Kathleen, then please do that, and I'm sure I can respond to those at a later time.
That was really awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's gonna give maybe just a couple more seconds here, just in case anyone does have. Actually, there are a couple questions in the Q&A. I can read them out. So Rob says, "Is there an easy way to obtain these documents? And do your archives produce lesson plans for teachers?"
Yes, so I don't know whether you saw the slides that I put up at the beginning. Let me just share my screen again, and I'll go back to those. So the lessons that we've done specifically on this, if I go back to back here, move that out the way. Where are we? Probably somewhere around here. Let me go back. I may have to very quickly scroll back through all of these. Do it this way. I'll come out of there, and I will go back to the links which I gave. So let me put that one up. And if I share my screen again. I think I'm sharing the wrong screen. Let me try that one more time. Share two. So this is our education collection here. So you can find an enormous number of education resources on the education website at that link there. Specifically relating to the American Revolution, we have 3 lessons based around our collection. The first one about the Boston Tea Party, which you can get from that QR code. Claire, I'm assuming that you'll be able to share this presentation with people afterwards as well.
Yeah, actually, would you mind emailing it to me?
Yeah, I will do
the
that.
whole copy of the video, or just the presentation?
I'm happy for you to share both.
Okay, let's do that. So I'll send. I also want to post about these specifically, like the education side of all the resources and everything. So I'll post a clip of the webinar and post this as well.
So we also have the second lesson around kind of political ideas, and then finally, despite the heading being wrong, I'll correct that, around the early conflict. So this will have some of those documents, not all of them, but some of the documents that I've used this evening, and activities based around those. We will be developing more of these as we kind of progress through the anniversaries of the Revolutionary War.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a question about that. And he says, Andrew, what would you want Americans to know about the 250th commemoration here in the States?
I think a kind of clearer understanding really about that relationship that existed between Britain and the American colonies, and that idea that in many respects this was a conflict. I noticed there was a question about how many people supported the British government. Well, we do know that at the end of the war, after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, that somewhere in the region of 1.5 million people, which I think out of a population of around 4 million, 1.5 million people left the newly independent American states, going to Canada largely, or down to the Caribbean, or coming back to Britain. So that's a clear indication that perhaps nearly half of the population didn't want an independent America, and actually were prepared to leave and move to other British colonies. And you know, of course, one of the requirements of the Treaty of Paris was that those formerly enslaved people were required to be returned because they were deemed to be property that had been removed by the British. And Section 7 of the Treaty of Paris of 1783 required the returning of formerly enslaved and now freed people. So there was a significant number. You know, it's certainly somewhere heading towards 40, maybe even more than 40% of the population that actually leave after the war.
That is so fascinating. I never learned about that in school. That's so cool to learn. Okay, we just got another question from John. Why was there no similar independence movements in the other British colonies in the Americas?
That's really interesting, isn't it? Why does Canada remain faithful? That's probably, you know, one of the key questions. And the answer, I think, you know, is quite complex. It's partly because, now, interestingly, the one of the things that really kick off and ramp up tension in the American colonies is the passing of the Quebec Act in 1774, which is an attempt to, and effectively a successful attempt, to integrate the French Canadian into British Canada after the end of the French and Indian Wars. So you have this large population in Quebec who are French, who are Catholic, and the Quebec Act is a successful attempt, really, to win them over to become loyal subjects of the British in Canada. I think that's highly significant because, of course, Quebec is absolutely crucial to events. So there's an attempt to try and foment rebellion in Quebec against the British in the early part of the war. It then becomes a key launch pad for British attempts to split the American forces, as we know from the campaign in 1777 around Saratoga and Ticonderoga and so on. And I think it's because basically, you know, the issues which drive American independence are less powerful and less strong in Canada, and likewise in the Caribbean. And ultimately, I think, you know, what we have to realize is that when it comes down to, the end of the war in 1782 and so on, effectively what the British decide is that, and I don't want to sound rude, but that America just isn't worth the hassle. That they've committed to the Caribbean colonies are far more valuable economically, are far more valuable than the American colonies, and that it's just not worth the danger of losing the Caribbean to the French and the Spanish. And so they commit their naval forces in particular to defending the Caribbean rather than trying to persist with the war in America, because I think the feeling is that America doesn't pay its way. It's as simple as that. It's been a huge drain with the French and Indian War. It's now been a huge drain with the Revolutionary War, and it's not really paying its way in the way that the Caribbean was paying.
That's fascinating. I'll try not to take it personally that we weren't worth it, but so we have one final question. Is that okay? I know we're at the end of our time
Yes,
here,
no,
just
that's fine.
to wrap it up. It basically is asking you to put the presentation in like 2 seconds, but Shannon says, my students often ask how the American Revolution is taught in Great Britain. Any quick guidance on what I can tell my students when they ask this question?
Rather shamefully, I think a lot of British students, a lot of British teachers and British people in general have very poor knowledge about the American Revolution. I think many people are surprised that America was formerly a British colony, and that the Revolutionary War was fought and lost by the British. I think there's a tendency for us to, from the British perspective, to kind of forget what we lost, and we move very quickly to establishing our empire elsewhere. Australia, India, Africa, and so on, rapidly are developed as alternatives to America. It's the first empire that we build, and it's the first empire that we lose, and it is replaced. And I think that's still an attitude that we have today, that we tend to teach much more about the British Empire that was successful rather than the British Empire that failed.
That's really interesting. That's fascinating. We also tend to, I won't say us, but a lot of folks will tend to focus on the positives of America too. So we are right with you. So I'm going to, well, I really appreciate your time and all of these insights. This was fascinating. Like I said, I wasn't taught this side of history in my history classes, and I would say that that's probably the case for a lot of folks here. So we're so grateful for you being here.
You're welcome. It's been
I
lovely to present to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So this was the first of 4 back to school webinar series with NCHE. We have 3 more coming up. I just put the link in the chat. So we have one tomorrow on the social studies field guide. That's at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. We have one on Tuesday with Sherry McMahon, and one on Thursday with a panel of history educators talking about advocacy. So thank you again, Andrew. Thank you all so much for being here. The recording will be up online shortly, and we will send out those resources as soon as possible. Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
very
Thank you for
much.
coming. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Good night.
Bye.